And we are back for Overanalyzing House of the Dragon, our really long series on how it came to be that Rhaenyra's Blacks faced off against Aegon's Greens. After a very long time of passing over women, Rhaenyra Targaryen has now been named heir after Daemon Targaryen was framed for a joke. He then has an incident with a dragon egg before needing to find a new distraction, and thus enters the War of the Stepstones. When King Viserys took Alicent Hightower to wife in 106 AC, House Velaryon was notable for its absence. Princess Rhaenyra poured for her stepmother at the feast, and Queen Alicent kissed her and named her daughter. The princess was amongst the women who disrobed the king and delivered him to the bedchamber of his bride. Laughter and love ruled the Red Keep that night. Whilst across Blackwater Bay, Lord Corlys the Sea Snake welcomed the king's brother, Prince Daemon, to a war council. The prince had suffered all he could stand of the Vale of Arryn, Runestone, and his lady wife. Dark Sister was made for nobler tasks than slaughtering sheep, he is reported to have told the Lord of Tides. She has a thirst for blood. But it was not rebellion that the prince had in mind. He saw another path to power. So next we hear briefly of the wedding of Viserys and Alicent before moving on to the War of the Stepstones. Now, first on this wedding, it's of course ridiculous that Gildain is claiming that this is a happy time, at least when speaking of Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra's mother died not too long ago, which also made Viserys into an alcoholic, and now Viserys is marrying an 18-year-old girl who is claiming to be Rhaenyra's mom. Not too many children would be happy about this, let alone an 8-year-old. Not to mention the creepiness of undressing your dad so he can have sex with your teenage stepmom. If there was laughter and love about, Rhaenyra was certainly not part of it. Then there's the War in the Stepstones. Now on this, I'd like to say that there's many things about the War in the Stepstones that don't really make sense, which we will get into. It's either a weird and crafty power play by Corlys Velaryon, or a rather messy plot device by George R. R. Martin to move Daemon into the Black Camp and occupy characters while children grow up. Now, assuming the former, let us start out by saying that Gildain begins with a lie. He frames the war as a scheme for Daemon Targaryen to gain power, that he flew to Driftmark and was welcomed in by the Velaryons. No explanation is ever given to why Viserys was suddenly okay with Daemon leaving his lady wife after being ordered to return to her. However, later we find out that the war was in fact Corlys Velaryon's idea, and that he was searching for a willing partner in war. Daemon was willing to go to war because he sought glory, not power. And really, the later story of Corlys starting the war makes the most sense. The Stepstones affected Velaryon trade. Meanwhile, how the war would lead to power for Daemon or a path to the Iron Throne is extremely murky. Perhaps one could argue that Daemon wanted to get in good with Corlys because he wanted to marry Laena Velaryon from the beginning, somehow assuming his lady wife Rhea Royce would die in that hawking accident. But Laena is the heir to nothing. And Daemon's rule over the Stepstones is frequently mocked as inconsequential. So really there was no reason for Daemon to go to war except for glory. While Corlys Velaryon could be scheming, Daemon Targaryen does not seem to be. The Stepstones, the chain of rocky islands between Dorne and the disputed lands of Essos, had long been a haunt of outlaws, exiles, wreckers, and pirates. Of themselves the isles were of little worth, but placed as they were, they controlled the sea lanes to and from the narrow sea, and merchant ships passing through those waters were often preyed on by their inhabitants. Still, for centuries such depredations had remained no more than a nuisance. 10 years earlier, however, the free cities of Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh had put aside their ancient enmities to make common cause in a war against Volantis. After defeating the Volantines in the Battle of the Borderland, the three victorious cities had entered into an eternal alliance and formed a strong new power, the Triarchy, better known in Westeros as the Kingdom of the Three Daughters, as each of the free cities considered itself a daughter of Valyria of old. Or, more rudely, the Kingdom of the Three Whores, though this kingdom was without a king, being governed by a council of 33 magisters. Once Volantis sued for peace and withdrew from the disputed lands, the three daughters had turned their gaze westward, sweeping over the Stepstones with their combined armies and fleets under the command of the Myrish Prince Admiral Craghas Drahar, who earned the sobriquet Craghas Crabfeeder when he staked out hundreds of captured pirates on the wet sands, to drown beneath the rising tide. And so here we hear about the situation in the Stepstones. Because these islands exist here, in this spot, between the narrow sea and anywhere else, we find that plenty of trade must pass through. And since this area wasn't really owned by anyone, it was historically a place where pirates would hide to prey on passing ships. However, Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh have joined together into the Three Daughters, and they have conquered the Stepstones and now charge tolls for passing through. In a sense, nothing much has changed. Merchants pay a price for passage, either to pirates or to a governing body. It's kind of a wash. In fact, the Triarchy's privateers are doing the same things the pirates did, including kidnapping people and selling them into slavery. In fact, this whole Stepstone situation seems to be based loosely on real history. Commercial trade needed to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean Sea, and there was always risk of attack and kidnappings from Barbary pirates. And although the systems of governments and alliances would change between Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis, the piracy endured, whether it be from actual pirates or government-backed privateers. Now, back to Ice and Fire. We are never given any political reason why Myr, Lys, and Tyrosh suddenly get along, except for that they went to war with Volantis, and there doesn't seem to be any connection between the current political climate and that Myrish invasion of Tarth that killed Aemon. And all of those trips that Daemon Targaryen took across the Narrow Sea aren't really relevant. Political stuff is simply happening in Myr, Lys, and Tyrosh. There's not much rhyme and reason to it, so don't look into it too deeply. Now we are also introduced briefly to Craghas Crabfeeder, who is an admiral for Myr, who becomes infamous for slowly drowning pirates. This cruel torture reminds us of the Boltons and the crucifixions in Slaver's Bay, but in our world, at various points in history, the punishment for piracy was indeed drowning. This was the case with, say, Oliver Cromwell in England, and pirates were put in the Thames River and drowned with the high tide. The conquest and annexation of the Stepstones by the Kingdom of the Three Daughters at first met with only approval from the Lords of Westeros. Order had replaced chaos, and if the Three Daughters demanded a toll of any ship passing through their waters, that seemed a small price to pay to be rid of the pirates. The avarice of Craghas Crabfeeder and his partners in conquest soon turned feelings against them, however. The toll was raised again, and yet again, soon becoming so ruinous that merchants who had once paid gladly now sought to slip past the galleys of the Triarchy as once they had the pirates. Trahar and his Lysene and Tyroshi co-admirals seemed to be vying with each other to see who was the greediest, men complained. The Lyseni became especially loathed, for they claimed more than coin from passing ships, taking off women, girls, and comely young boys to serve in their pleasure gardens and pillow houses. Amongst those thus enslaved was Lady Johanna Swann, a 15-year-old niece of the Lord of Stonehelm. When her infamously niggardly uncle refused to pay the ransom, she was sold to a pillow house, where she rose to become the celebrated courtesan known as the Black Swan, and ruler of Lys in all but name. Alas, her tale, however fascinating, has no bearing upon our present history. Now, as I said before, the ridding of the pirates by the Three Daughters just replaced the old pirates with new government-backed privateers. And in our world, people didn't really make much of a distinction between the two because there wasn't much of a distinction. Both pirates and privateers were pretty ruthless, attacked merchant ships, and kidnapped people. The latter just had state sponsorship, and the state took a cut. And then we get an odd inclusion of the fate of Johanna Swann, who was kidnapped and sold into sex slavery, only to rise to essentially become the ruler of Lys. And then Gildain claims that the story is completely irrelevant, which is really not believable. Keep in mind, the Triarchy does eventually join the Dance of the Dragons, siding with the Greens, likely because they hated Daemon Targaryen and Corlys Velaryon for the war in the Stepstones. If Johanna Swann were ruling Lys, she would be part of everything. Her political decisions would be part of the war. Now, we do not know how she's involved exactly, but Lysene ships have a very different fate compared to Tyroshi and Myrish ships in the Battle of the Gullet during the dance. The result seems to imply that the Lysene had different loyalties than the Tyroshi and Myrish. That is, it may be that the Black Swan was secretly a black. On top of this, we have the famously confusing tale of Sir Byron Swan trying to kill a dragon during the dance. Whether it be Vhagar, a green faction dragon, or Syrax, a black faction dragon, or Sunfire, again a green faction dragon. The stories contradict, and the discussion of which side of the war Sir Byron's Swan fought for is specifically talked about between Tyrion and Haldon Halfmaester. The Swans were supposedly on the side of the Greens, but then again their overlords, the Baratheons, did waver during the war, and we have this whole Johanna Swann situation. Both Johanna and Sir Byron were supposedly on the side of the Greens, but were involved in situations that make us question their loyalty. Were they Greens or were they Blacks? Were they even on the same side? Did Johanna have loyalty to her family, or did she hate them for failing to pay her ransom? What did Sir Byron feel about the ransom of his, perhaps, cousin? Was he loyal to his family or not? Arguments can be made either way, but certainly Johanna Swann is very relevant to the story, and Gildain is hiding something. Of all the lords of Westeros, none suffered so much from these practices as Corlys Velaryon, Lord of Tides, whose fleet had made him as wealthy and as powerful as any man in the Seven Kingdoms. The Sea Snake was determined to put an end to the Triarchy's rule over the Stepstones, and in Daemon Targaryen he found a willing partner, eager for gold and glory that victory and war would bring him. Shunning the king's wedding, they had laid their plans in high tide on the Isle Driftmark. Lord Velaryon would command the fleet, Prince Daemon the army. They would be greatly outnumbered by the forces of the three daughters, but the prince would also bring to battle the fires of his dragon Caraxes, the Bloodworm. And so next we hear about the true source of the war in the Stepstones, Corlys Velaryon. He makes a good deal of money off trade and is annoyed at the tolls and privateers in the Stepstones, and so he reaches out to Daemon Targaryen. Now again, I don't know if this is author oversight or grand scheming from Corlys Velaryon. Yes, Corlys going to war does seem logical. However, bringing in Daemon Targaryen to the whole thing is a bit off. Keep in mind, if the Triarchy were causing trouble in the Stepstones, it's not just Corlys that would be affected. The Pentashi, the Lorathi, the Ibbenese, and notably the Braavosi would be affected too. One would think that they would want to join the war, especially when the son of the Sea Lord of Braavos is betrothed to Laena Velaryon. Now one could say, well, maybe Corlys needed a dragon. Except, you know who has a dragon? His wife, who rides Meleys, and his son, who rides Seasmoke, and his daughter, who rides Vhagar. Corlys Velaryon has 3 dragons at his disposal. He certainly doesn't need Daemon's Caraxes. Now yes, at the beginning of the war, Laena and Laenor are a little young at 13 and 12 respectively, but he still has Rhaenys and the war goes on for 9 years and we never hear about the Velaryons ever using their dragons. It's kind of ridiculous. Not to mention, after the war ends in 115, the problem of tolls in the Stepstones simply evaporates. The Triarchy continues to exist, but suddenly there isn't a problem. Now, trying to find logic to it all, it may be that really, Corlys didn't care that much about the tolls and they were in fact never a big deal. Which is why the other cities tolerated them and the problem disappeared. And it could be that Corlys didn't use his Braavosi allies or his family's dragons because the entire war was orchestrated just so Corlys could befriend Daemon Targaryen. With Daemon on his side, Corlys would control 4 dragons to Viserys' 1 dragon, which is ridden by Rhaenyra. And this massive power imbalance is the thing that eventually led to the brokering of Laenor and Rhaenyra's marriage. So, maybe this all did come out of the Alicent-Viserys wedding. That said, it was 8 years between the start of the war and the marriage of Rhaenyra to Laenor. If the war was all part of Corlys' plan, it was some serious dedication. It's not our purpose here to recount the details of the private war Daemon Targaryen and Corlys Velaryon waged on the Stepstones. Suffice to say that the fighting began in 106 AC. Daemon Targaryen had little difficulty assembling an army of landless adventurers and second sons, and won many victories during the first 2 years of the conflict. In 108 AC, when at last he came face to face with Craghas Crabfeeder, he slew him single-handed and cut off his head with Dark Sister. King Viserys, doubtless pleased to be rid of his troublesome brother, supported his efforts with regular infusions of gold, and by 109 AC, Daemon Targaryen and his army of sellswords and cutthroats controlled all but 2 of the islands, and the Sea Snake's fleet had taken firm control of the waters between. During this brief moment of victory, Prince Daemon declared himself King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea, and Lord Corlys placed a crown upon his head. But their kingdom was far from secure. The next year, the Kingdom of the Three Daughters dispatched a fresh invasion force under the command of a devious Triarchy captain named Ricalio Rindoon, surely one of the most curious and flamboyant rogues in the annals of history, and Dorne joined the war in alliance with the Triarchy. Fighting resumed. And so here Gildain calls the war in the Stepstones a private war of Corlys and Daemon, and so he doesn't want to go into it too much. This statement of not wanting to elaborate being an addition to Fire and Blood not appearing in the Rogue Prince. Though he later reveals that Viserys was financing the whole thing, which means the war wasn't so private after all. It was the Crown's gold with Westerosi soldiers. Somehow, though, it's not Viserys' war at all. Later, Gildain even has the gall to call Viserys a man of peace. Of course, the Crown's influx of cash does show that Viserys very much supported the war, which may be the reason why Viserys was okay with Daemon leaving the Vale and disobeying an order. Or at least it's a theory. It's worth noting that the Hightowers make much of their money from trade as well, so it's likely that Otto Hightower would have fully supported the war if the tolls were actually a big deal, and if not, he would have supported it as a chance to kill off Daemon Targaryen. Now we find out that Daemon kills Craghas Crabfeeder and wins the war for a moment, being crowned king, but then the war continues with Ricalio Rindoon taking over Crabfeeder's place. Ricalio is a flamboyant Triarchy who's naturally supposed to make us think of Daario Naharis. He eventually becomes king of the Stepstones himself and has some adventures after the dance, but this isn't for a long time. As a character, he doesn't really affect the story here at hand or the later Dance of the Dragons. And this is a good place to stop. Next time we'll talk about Alicent's children and the 5th anniversary tourney. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.